48 hours of madness. Yo, what's going on? It's someone that's no one, and welcome to today's report. Today's report was sent in by Charles, and this is a part 1 of 2, just to let you guys know. So, part 2 is going to come out whenever he sends me it, and yeah, I mean, just this part 1 sounds pretty crazy, so I don't even know what part 2 is going to be like, but this report happened in 2016. The drugs used was ketamine, cocaine, and 25x-NBOMe. The dose, he said it was hard to say. Gender, male. Weight, 65 kilograms or 145 pounds. Age, 19 at the time. Height, 5'9". Prior experience, years of weed smoking, and he has done all the drugs listed prior. And where this happened, Northeast England at several places. So, pretty wild binge experience here where Charles and a couple of his friends just kind of go ham. So I think you guys will like it, and without further ado, let's dive right into it. Before starting this story, I would like to preface by saying that this sort of binging and mixing behavior shouldn't be encouraged at all, and I personally strongly advise others to learn from my mistakes in this report. It was my 19th birthday when this started. I had organized to meet up with 2 old friends who I hadn't seen for quite some time due to our studies moving us away from each other. In the past, we always had a fun time together, often having long drug-fueled nights of ridiculous ideas, hatching of almost insane concepts, and ideas for increasingly bizarre creative projects, and it was always a great time. Our usual substances of choice would be a cocktail of ketamine, weed, and cocaine. The ratios of each depending on the mood of the night, but this time, as a special treat, I had gotten a hold of some LSD that I was assured was some high-strength product that I was excited to try out with them. I was at this point familiar with psychedelic substances such as Lucy, shrooms, and mescaline, but my other 2 friends, who we will call Chris and Ella for the purposes of this story, hadn't tried quite as much. On the day of my birthday, I met up with Ella in the center of our city to go get a tattoo with. I have built a tradition at this point to get a tattoo every year on my birthday. On the walk there, we tallied up how much of what we had in total to share between us that evening. After some calculations, we figured that we had about 3 grams of ket, 2 grams of coke, roughly 600 micrograms of LSD each for the evening. Alongside God knows how much weed to spare, 3 tablets MDMA of 60 milligrams each, about 30 canisters of nitrous oxide lying around, as well as a bottle of amyl nitrate. This was a serious stash for 3 people and 1 night. Once we realized how much we had, we knew we were in for one hell of a night. Was looking to be my best birthday yet, but boy, was I mistaken. While me and Ella were still on the way to get my appointment done, we decided we may as well have a key of ket, purely for the novelty of getting a tattoo done while bumped up on Special K. We headed down a more quiet alley the street over from the parlor, where she pulled out a decent-sized bag of ket and I grabbed my keys from my pocket. We both took a pretty sizable bump, cleaned up our noses, and headed into the parlor. For reference, this is not something you should do. While signing the paperwork for a tattoo before you get it done, most forms will have a line saying that if you sign, you are not under the influence of any drugs or alcohol. Doing this is a very stupid idea and generally disrespectful to the artist in retrospect from my part. I was filling out the various papers and handing over my pre-established design as I started to feel the gentle buzz creep into my mind. By the time we were set up and sat down for the work to start, Ella was very preoccupied by something outside the window, and my reflexes were noticeably slowed down. The artist started working, and I could feel the familiar feeling of watching yourself doing what you're currently doing, but as if you're watching a film from a camera behind you. I felt next to no pain from the needle, despite it being on the bone of my wrist, to my artist's surprise. The session was short as the design was fairly small. It took us both a couple of seconds to stand up, but once we had paid, we made it back outside without a hitch. When I talked to the artist another time, he said he could tell we weren't quite on the planet, but he wouldn't take any offense and promised not to tell his boss, which would have probably had us banned from the parlor. After we walked back into town, we took a couple more bumps of K on the journey. Now both of us truly floating a couple inches off the ground, our bodies not feeling like our own, just wandering around town until Chris got off work and our evening could start properly. Sometime later, we received a text from him saying he had finished off a bit early and we could go meet him in a bar. It was about 20 minutes walking from where we were to meet him before we headed back to their apartment. When we got there, about an hour later, our mental state hindering our walking speed a little, Chris had already had a drink with a friend of his from work who I had met a couple times before, but didn't feel entirely comfortable around him in general. It was nothing from him as a person. He was nice enough. We just didn't vibe especially well. We had different senses of humor and interest. Nothing radically serious. Me and Ella were anxious to get off home and kick off the night fully, but we were hung at the bar for some amount of time. The recollection of how long it was escapes me totally. When we were ready to go, Chris said, "Oh, Jack," his friend from work, "is going to come with us for a bit and have a drink before heading off," seemingly from nowhere without consulting me or Ella beforehand. We went along with this proposition since it seemed a little harsh to just tell him to go home. The journey back to our apartment now sits as a bit of a blur in my memory. I remember me and Ella hitting Marquette before getting on the subway and finding the sunset and alternating light of the subway very disorienting, and the 15-minute journey feeling like we had been going on for hours. We finally made it back just as darkness was coming in and the streetlights were coming on. When we were inside, Ella and I had a brief talk about how neither of us were especially comfortable with Jack being there, but thought we could wait until he headed home before we kicked things up a gear. After having a small meal to line our stomachs a little, we sat around together making general conversation and watching a couple shows. The cat had worn off me and Ella at this point, so we decided to share a couple joints together to help us unwind in what had become a strangely tense atmosphere that we had noticed, but Chris hadn't at all. He and Jack had carried on drinking once we had come home, so they were starting to get pretty drunk. It was then that we decided to head into the bathroom and hit some more K. So I decided to have some of the LSD I had stored in my bag. I cut off myself a tab and a half as a starter and popped it under my tongue. A couple lines of K laid out for when it started hitting. At the time, my tolerance for LSD had been built up pretty high due to very regular intake, so this didn't occur to me to be an especially intense trip. I waited until the blotters had dissolved in my mouth before having a line of ketamine laid out on a plate in front of me, while Ella sat on her bed, her mind slowly leaving her body as her eyes gently rolled around the room over and over. My mind seemed to have settled down a lot with the changing of the rooms, so I decided to have another 2 tabs of acid, now having ingested maybe 400 micrograms plus of double-dipped strong acid. But I realized that the tabs tasted of something, but I had dismissed it as just a taste left over from the food and weed, but this was a strange, bitter taste that couldn't have come from that. Suddenly, my sluggish drug-addled brain realized that I recognized the flavor to be the flavor of 25x-NBOMe, also known as NBOMe. Fuck. While my tolerance for LSD might have been high, there was no way I was prepared for a high-strength, unknown amount of NBOMe to be filling my head. I wrestled with my mind not to panic, to try to keep calm and relax, because panicking wouldn't help anyone in this situation. I looked around for something to use as an anchor to help bring some calm to myself, but my eye was caught by the small, in my eyes, mound of ket and a plastic straw left on the plate in front of me. As I'm sure many people know, when your mind is in such a state, you definitely don't think through some decisions quite as much as would be best in the situation. I said to Ella, "You okay if I finish this bit off?" She replied in the small mumble I didn't catch. She was far too gone to communicate properly, so I ducked down and swept it all up. In retrospect, this was no small amount of ketamine, but it was probably close to about 500 milligrams. As I went back against the wall, I could feel something weird tugging at the back of my mind. I knew something big was coming. I approached with increasing speed, faster and faster. I could feel my breathing become more rapid and panicked. In an instant, I knew I was gone. I fell down into the deep darkness that is a serious K-hole. But this was different to my previous experiences in the K-hole blackness. I found myself in a fully waking dream state. I was standing in the middle of a large hall. There were cold marble slabs under my bare feet and a gentle hum of chanting and singing which had a deeply spiritual feel which resonated in what felt like the core of my soul. I looked around. I found myself in some huge temple. The ceiling reached far, far overhead, and the characteristics of the place seemed to be mixed with Middle Eastern Islamic and Indian influences, mixed with classic Gothic architecture with the patterns and images etched into the smooth pale marble, which made the structure. To my left there was a solid wall, but on my right it was a series of columns, looking out onto a breathtakingly beautiful sunset over a flourishing countryside, which gently flooded the white marble with an elegant, calm golden light of a serene, quiet twilight. At the other end of the hall, there was a large archway which led to another selection of the monastery. But as I looked down toward it, a figure in dark robes slowly walked into my vision, their deep hood pulled far over their face, holding a swinging incense burner. They turned to look at me, but shadow enshrouded any facial features they might have had. As sinister as the figure looked, when they carried on walking, I felt a great need to follow them, and so I passed through the hall to another room. The next hall was even vaster than the last, with several steps leading down to the floor level. Across the hall, there were 2 chairs laid out and a marble chess table built straight into the floor set in between them, and there was a shape of a figure draped in long flowing, ever-shifting ebony robes sitting in one of the chairs with its back to me. As my eyes fell upon the figure, I was filled to my core with an unescapable dread and primal fear which resonated from the essence of my being. Yet I didn't choose to run, but felt drawn to fill the other chair. As I crossed the room, several of the other hooded monk figures replicated the movements of the first one between the columns to my right, walking out, looking at me, then proceeding to disappear behind the pillar in front of them. I sat myself down opposite of the figure, and it dawned on me that this was death itself in a form my mind could understand, and the game we were going to play was for my own life. This was limbo, and I was stuck here until the game was finished, and that would dictate if I was going to live or die. The game proceeded with death letting me move first, but when death made their first move, I was suddenly sucked straight from that scene, and I realized I had been transported somewhere. I was outside in the middle of nowhere. It was snowing heavily, and the snow was several feet deep. I had misstepped while walking and fallen into a small ravine. My right leg was stuck in between 2 slabs of stone under the snowdrift. The stone was crushing my bones and cutting into my flesh just above my knee, and the snow was getting heavier as light vanished quickly from the day. I could feel the cold setting into my bones. If I didn't do something drastic soon, I would be dead within minutes. I felt the final warmth of a body dying of hypothermia blast through my body, and from somewhere dragged a spurt of adrenaline and heaved my leg free, snapping several bones and leaving me in screaming agony, but I had made it out. I pulled myself forward through the snow, lying face down, dragging forward with my hands, desperate to survive. Then I was back at the chess table, death letting go of their piece from the first move. I understood then that for every move death made, I would be put in a situation similar to the last one, where I would have to prove that I wanted to cling on to life and show them that I was worth of being given it. In the past, I have had several suicidal thoughts and actually attempted suicide several times earlier in life to no avail. But for some reason right now, I would have done anything to stay alive. I made my next move, trying to focus on the game. Then death reached forward for their next move, the background chanting growing louder around us. Again, I was pulled out of the temple and into another situation where I was fighting for my life with every essence of my being. I sadly can't recall what these other situations were as clearly as the first one, but each held its own new set of challenges, stressing different parts of my physical and mental strength. As they proceeded, I felt like this was more than just my body and this life I was playing for, but my actual soul itself. Like, if I lost this, then I would never live again, and my soul would be held trapped in eternal torment forevermore. The next I remember is being released. I don't remember winning the game, but I guess I must have proven worthy of living on into the future for some reason. Suddenly, I was back in the real world. My head jerked up, and I was still in the same position as before. But before I can move properly, I have to lurch over to the bin in Ella's room to throw up whatever food was left in my stomach from earlier. I still have no idea how much time had passed, but it was long enough for Ella to have some of her senses back. When she heard me puking, she leant over the bed to ask if I was okay. I said I just had the craziest experience, but I couldn't explain it right now. I just needed some water and some fresh air maybe. I knew that was enough kept for me for the night, but the NBOMe was just starting to get a hold of me. There was much more night to go.